But what we see is that also in the case of Nazi perpetrators, the killing of women and children, for example, for some of the policemen, was a threshold activity that some used alcohol to be able to cross, right? But even more importantly, as I was doing this research, one of the things that I saw was that the idea of drinking also often led to further acts of violence.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with your host, writer and scholar of genocide studies, Sabah Karim. I am your co-host, Luis Gonzalez Aponte.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Today we are honored to speak with Edward B. Westermann, a Regents Professor of History at Texas A&M University-San Antonio, and a renowned scholar on the Holocaust and military history. In his latest book, Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, Westermann uncovers how alcohol consumption and revelry among the SS and police became routine rituals of humiliation during the Third Reich's atrocities in Eastern Europe. Please enjoy our conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Westermann, for joining us today. To go straight in your work, you emphasize how alcohol was integral to the orchestration and execution of mass murder. Can you elaborate on how the Nazis systematically used alcohol as a tool to bond perpetrators and facilitate atrocities? And perhaps touch on the effects of consumption before, during, and after the act of terror.
Okay, wow, that's a great question or questions, Luis, to start off with. Thank you. Yeah, I think really you started with a very important point about the research, the idea of how alcohol is used to bond the perpetrators, and the way in which camaraderie is created amongst the perpetrators, and the rituals that they use. That's part of drinking is one of those rituals, but other rituals like hunting rituals, like rituals of humiliation, things that I describe in the book. So when we look at alcohol, I think it's really important to say this at the front end. Alcohol is neither necessary nor sufficient for what happens in the Holocaust. The Holocaust happens with or without the perpetrators drinking. However, what my research was able to do was to provide me insights into the way in which they used alcohol in things like celebratory ritual, for example, the way that alcohol was incorporated into facilitation of murder, so additional acts of murder. So when we think about alcohol use in general, we think about maybe, hey, I got promoted at my job, I passed my course, and let's go out and have a drink, or it's my birthday, let's celebrate the birthday. And social bonding is something we all understand. Maybe at a holiday or at the New Year's, we see that type of bonding as well. But what we don't often think about is also that alcohol is used for disinhibition. So in the case of looking at perpetrators, there are some perpetrators who cross the threshold into violence through the use of drinking, just like there are some individuals who, after drinking, are have disinhibition with respect to their ability to do something, whether it's to ask somebody to dance, in a very mundane kind of thing, right? I'm able to get the courage to do that. But what we see is that also in the case of Nazi perpetrators, the killing of women and children, for example, for some of the policemen, was a threshold activity that some used alcohol to be able to cross, right? But even more importantly, as I was doing this research, one of the things that I saw was that the idea of drinking also often led to further acts of violence. So in the book, I talk about, I'll give you one example, how it's New Year's Eve. And so there's these group of SS men, they're outside a ghetto in occupied Poland, and they're celebrating bringing in the new year, like many of us will probably do in 2024 to 2025. It'll be that night. We might have some drinks and celebrate. And the thing that they decide to do after it's midnight is they decide to go into the Jewish ghetto, and they decide to hunt Jews and kill Jews. And the person who's there, the witness who remembers them coming in, says they came in and they hunted us as a kind of sport. And she uses that word to reflect their attitude as they were doing that, using this hunting as a type of sport. And when I talk about this specific episode, I talk about why it's facilitation, because there was nothing that should have led them to celebrate by starting the new year by killing Jews, right? That was something they chose, they wanted to do as a result of celebration. So I think that when we look at alcohol, one of the difficulties in this subject is it's used in many different ways and at different times by perpetrators in different ways. But when we start to look at how it's incorporated into different type of rituals, how it's used by men in a performative sense, like being able to hold your liquor and still being able to perform, right? So I have college students who recognize that behavior, whether it's in the bar, your ability to continue to drink and not show the effects of it. Students who play beer pong, for example, or quarters, those types of games are performative games that are tied to drinking amongst your peers. So what became really important to me as I looked at this topic was not only the idea of intoxication, but the way in which performative masculinity and militarized masculinity in a Nazi context also dominated the way in which these men saw themselves, not only in the killing that they did, but in the way they interacted with their colleagues. So there was quite a bit there, and another thing that I think is important to talk about in terms of intoxication, it's not just literal intoxication. There's metaphorical intoxication, and that metaphorical intoxication is the control of the lives and bodies of others in colonial spaces, and that's not limited, for example, to the Nazi context. So, for example, I've looked at Rwanda. You can see some of these very same behaviors uh, that are also then uh, uh, evident in the case of Rwanda, in the case of the Balkans, for example, Serbian perpetrators, especially using some of these aspects of drinking, performative masculinity, that leads also to things like sexual violence. So that's a lot, obviously, to unpack. In there, there's quite a bit. There's quite a bit to talk about there, but that kind of gives you an overview of some of the key parts of this research in writing the book.
I want to go ahead and stay on one of those last points that you made and reference that in your work you cite Peggy Sunday's observation that acts of communal violence, such as gang rape, can serve to reinforce fraternity and male bonding among perpetrators. And given this understanding, how do you see the behaviors and dynamics that you've studied during the Holocaust manifesting in modern contexts, such as fraternity hazing rituals that involve alcohol abuse and extreme acts of violence or humiliation? I mean, perhaps you can speak to displays of hypermasculinity in these settings and outside of this domestic context.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that we as historians, especially historians of the Holocaust or genocide, want to do is to be able to make some of this material for our students, especially something that becomes something they can grasp, or maybe a little bit uncomfortable in some of the behaviors that they themselves at given times may exhibit that are not genocidal, but that show how the flip side of camaraderie can be a very kind of poisonous kind of event. And so, for example, Peggy Sanday's work on university gang rape, her book, where she talks about how in that setting, the fraternity that she was looking at, how alcohol and drinking rituals are used to bind guys together, in this case, men, but then also how not only alcohol is used for that binding ritual, but how also sexual violence is part of that as well. And the idea of gang rape becomes performative for the other members in the group as well, that you're showing being part of that group. And in fact, that's one of the things that in the Nazi East, we see the use of gang rape, communal sexual violence against groups of Slavic women, against Jewish women, as well. And to take your question, as you talked about earlier, again, I can go back to Rwanda, and we have cases here where we see exactly that same kind of communal violence, sexual violence against Tutsi women in particular. And looking at some of the literature in that case, we see in the case where women, in this case Hutu women, are cheerleading, are supporting that violence that men are performing for other men. And this idea of how gender plays into this communal violence, I think, is a really key point. Because as you mentioned, we talk about rugby teams, for example. That's one of those sports that is high profile, just like fraternities, and this idea of reputation for toughness and drinking, and unfortunately, often sexual violence. But it's not just male rugby teams. It can be also female rugby teams, as we've seen. And if you look at the headlines, where the hazing rituals that often cross into sexual violence or types of sexual assault are part of that. And that can be men or women. And this is where I think, Wendy Lauer's book that I talk about in my own book, Hitler's Furies, where she looked at the different types of roles of women, whether they were witnesses, whether they were accomplices, or whether they were perpetrators. But one of the key aspects that she talks about is in genocidal societies, it's a genocidal society, which you can't immediately divorce 50% of the society from, right? It becomes genocidal because it's a societal kind of endeavor that involves men and women. And I think that's really an important point, and one that when I have this conversation with my students, it's one that they don't immediately see, because in their mind they are often focused on male perpetration. And a new project I'm working on, which I describe as genocidal camaraderie. This camaraderie can be male or female camaraderie, or between groups, right? So it can be in the groups themselves of men and women, or it can be between the groups involving men and women together. So I think that that's really an important point that sometimes really gets lost. And Adam Jones, for example, has talked about some of his work looking at what he calls gendercide, but looking also at the Congo, where in looking at what happened in the Congo, the sexual violence, 41% of the violence that was sexual violence perpetrated against women was perpetrated by women against women, and 90% of the violence perpetrated against men was by men against men in the Congo in that study. And I think this is also one of those ideas where clearly that women are at greatest risk for sexual violence, and we see that over and over again. But as Will Storr and others have pointed out, one of the kind of things that we don't tend to think about, like female perpetrators as much, is male sexual violence. So violence committed against men, and we have a lot of reasons for that. The same kind of cultural taboos that are in place, shame that's involved in that. So I think it's really important, as you just kind of pointed out, Luis, is that we have to think in these broader terms about genocide, but also how these behaviors also infringe in some ways on normal social life. And I mean normal in quotation marks, or what we would consider to be university settings, sports settings, bar settings, for example, where we see these activities.
Sticking on that broader sense, I think that I recall you mentioning before in your work this metaphorical intoxication that these perpetrators, start to show. And in that, does this manifest itself in humiliation? Does it manifest itself in a way where you see the absence, or you see perhaps they don't need things like alcohol or narcotics to supply that sense of social lubricant to allow them to go ahead and enact these, violent acts?
Yeah, so one of the things that was really interesting in doing this was how humiliation and the humiliation of the other serves as kind of a group sense of intoxication. And I think we've we immediately, when I talk about this subject, how communal violence can be celebrated absent alcohol. We can think about lynchings in the Jim Crow South, right? For example, how those become, in some cases, celebratory acts, group settings, men, women, and children involved, picture postcards made and distributed after the fact. Right, so we see humiliation and killing can oftentimes be a social kind of, if you will, lubricant that you kind of talked about here. And in the Nazi case, it's very clear that many of the victims and survivors who talk about this, they reflect on how when the SS men engaged and SS females engaged in some of these activities, that they were trying to outperform each other. And so you have cases where the witnesses after the fact are saying, if one started to beat a prisoner, then another one might start to beat a prisoner. And the way that that witness was interpreted is that person wanted to show the other one how it's done. And that can even cross gender lines. And for your listeners who might be familiar with, Nazi Germany has a very kind of strict kind of gender ideology, if you will. So it's for men, young boys, to grow into soldiers, to be hard and to be tough. And young German women are supposed to essentially become bearers, mothers for the nation, right? They're going to bear the next generation. And the idea in Nazi Germany is that a good German girl, quotation marks, doesn't drink or smoke, for example, right? That she is the homemaker. Well, what we see in the concentration camps is what has been described as this idea of a zone of exception, where female SS guards are able to transgress against existing gender stereotypes. And I have an example that I talk about in the work where there's an SS man who's whipping a woman. She's being punished. So the 25, 50 lashes that prisoners would receive for these supposed transgressions. And what's really striking about this instance is that one of the female SS guards takes the whip away from the guy and says, "You're not doing it right." And she begins to whip the woman. And when I really thought about that, what was interesting was she was in a place, a zone of exception in the camp, where she was able to take on a male performative role, right? That outside that camp, she wouldn't have been able to do. And to kind of match up with the male guard. And the other area of zone of exception where we see this type of behavior is in the occupied Eastern Territory. So those conquered colonial spaces where this kind of behavior is also available. There's room for women to become killers. And another really horrific example of that happens in occupied Ukraine is there's a woman, Erna Petry. She's the wife of an SS officer, and they have an estate in Ukraine. And she remembers that estate, and they had Jewish workers and Ukrainian workers on their farm. But she remembers how her husband, if Jews were crossing the estate, they were trying to go into hiding, for example. She remembered how her husband would take them to a certain area on the estate, and he would execute them. And then one day she's out on the estate, and there's these four boys that have apparently broken out of a train transport. They're young boys. They don't have any clothes on. And she brings them, she has them on the stage, she brings them, and she first feeds them. And then she's waiting for her husband to come home because she knows what he's going to do. He's going to take those young men and he's going to execute them in that place on the estate. And she gets tired of waiting for her husband to come back. So what does she do? She goes and she executes the four boys, and she talks about how they're sobbing as she's doing it. And then after the war, the way that this story comes out is that after the war, she and her husband are in East Germany, and they become the objects of an investigation by state security for a different reason. But as they're being interrogated over a series of weeks, these long-term interrogations, the story about what they did, that her husband had been in the SS, that they'd been in Ukraine, it starts to come out. And the story about the killing of the boys comes out as well. And finally, she admits that the reason she did it, she says to the interrogator, I didn't want to stand behind the men. That's the term she uses. And in German, she wanted to show that she could do what the men did, right? So again, this idea of a woman being able to then, to take that role. And this idea of the use of the firearm is really an important point in this, because Elisa Mailander has done a lot of work, really good work with gender and with the concentration camps. In Germany proper, female concentration camp guards had whips, but they didn't have pistols, because a weapon was a male prerogative in the Nazi state and a symbol of kind of that masculinity, if you will. But in Auschwitz and Majdanek, women, female guards are allowed to have a pistol, but the way they normally use it is not by shooting prisoners, it's by beating prisoners with the pistol. So we see even the way in which these kind of gendered objects and the way that gender itself and expectations of violence among genders also kind of even influence in these areas. So I think this kind of nexus between gender and violence, really, to me, is really an important point to think about as we think about it. But what I was talking about there, to get back to your original question, was none of this was necessarily based on literal intoxication. It's based on the intoxication of the control of the lives and bodies of those other individuals. And I think that's really an important point to make, that a lot of these rituals happen not because people have been drinking, but it's because the power that they've been given over these individuals, and how that power itself is used as a kind of its own sense of importance or intoxication amongst the killers.
I have a comment more than a question right now. I'm just like thinking about how, you know, as a writer, we tend to be given these spaces where we explore how, for instance, women or men could be, portrayed in a different way, in an untraditional way. And I think what you're talking about here strikes me very much in the sense that how could we then explore these areas, like these scenarios of violence, of mass violence, and zoom into exploring how, alternative roles are ascribed to different genders. And of course, it's not a pretty picture. But I'm just thinking about these examples you gave of women using weapons differently than men, or women taking on these roles that are so atypical of them in those kinds of scenarios. So I'm very intrigued by that, and how I think there could be further study about using or transforming these negative spaces into possible areas of further research,
Yeah, well, what it reminds me of, Saba, is the idea in Chechnya, for example, right? We know that for traditional Muslim women in Chechnya, we know there was the bride stealing that took place, and how that is also tied to honor and what that meant. But we also know that during the Chechen wars, that the fact that sexual violence used against Muslim Chechnyan women led some of them, right? The shame, the cultural, if you will, the cultural pejorative that was tied to that they couldn't be able to marry after that, to join white tigers and other groups, to become then, it allowed them to become military members, snipers, right? And it allowed them to become suicide bombers, if you will, because that was a way to reclaim their honor and the honor in Chechen society. And in looking at some of that literature, it was also very interesting that that women, that the war itself in a very traditional society with male and female roles very defined as what women not being able to engage in direct violence as long as there are males in the household, how that war changed cultural values to create space for women to be able to do that. And in the case of the snipers, the fact that many of them, when they would shoot Russian soldiers, they would aim for the groin, right? So even how gendered and gendered violence that we also see in the Holocaust, this idea of males in the camps, for example, SS guards, really taking aim at genitalia for men, right? That becomes a special area of humiliation or abuse, and how these roles are male oriented, but like you said, how they can also, because of war and because of conflict or ideology, how they can be transformed and how they then start to make some of these what we would consider to be very rigid structures or very rigid values or cultural mores, how they start to become more plastic and more open. So I think that's really that in and of itself is a fascinating kind of comparative topic to think about, right? How does genocidal violence or war in a genocidal context, how does that start to deform traditional roles, and not just with women being victims of it, but how women then create their own space, or how society allows females now then to become part of that in a way that they otherwise would never have been allowed to.
I would like to open up a question and discussion for both of you. First, for Sabah, regarding the prosecution of perpetrators. And Sabah, you and I have talked before about an article that will soon be published of yours by the Journal of Genocide Research involving neuroscience and genocide. And considering your expertise with perpetrator studies and reflecting on Dr. Westermann's work on the role of alcohol in facilitating violence during the Holocaust, how do you view the use of inebriation by alcohol or even other narcotics as a defense in juridical proceedings? Historically, have there been instances where perpetrators have used this defense effectively, and what implications might this have for future legal cases involving similar claims? And specifically, how can juridical systems balance understanding the psychological effects of substances on behavior while ensuring accountability for heinous crimes?
I think that's a very good question, and I think it's a question that deserves another paper, after mine. My paper, the publication, is about the use of neuroscientific evidence, in trials involving young perpetrators, juveniles, and specifically child soldiers. So I focused on the case of Dominic Ongwen, who's a Ugandan child soldier. Well, the use of, I will just focus, on how alcohol comes in neuroscience. So far, if we are to apply neuroscientific evidence, the impact of alcohol on neuroscience, right, on the brain, and then use that as evidence in an international court to try a perpetrator, I think, first of all, it has not been done. It hasn't happened because this is very, very new, that just the use of neuroscientific evidence in international trials is new. But I think there would definitely be some case law out there decided at the state or federal level. So that means we're talking about local jurisdictions, especially in the US and Europe, because so far it is in these two main jurisdictions that there has been use of neuroscientific evidence. So there must be some case law at that level used, but I think we have to focus on the fact that most cases involving the effect of alcohol on behavior would have been approached with a behavioral psychology perspective. So I don't think we've so far used it from the perspective of neuroscience. And let's also remember that the impact of alcohol on the brain has already been displayed grandly through behavioral psychology, so that if ever we do use all of this evidence from the perspective of neuroscience, it would only come in handy to corroborate existing evidence. So what I'm trying to say, in other words, is that I think most of the data out there on the effects of alcohol on the brain, on behavior, has been documented by behavioral psychology. Neuroscience will just come in to complement existing knowledge. So I don't think, just from my perspective or from my research right now, that it's entirely going to change what we think about the impact, the effects of alcohol on behavior. But for sure, as I said, because neuroscientific evidence is a new area. It's a new epistemology which is penetrating the legal sphere. I think it is worth exploring that question, because I do think the advantage, which is what I'm trying to now focus on, the advantage of neuroscientific evidence is that although it is merely corroborating, right, it is also providing more details about what we already know. So it's just going to basically, provide a deeper insight into existing knowledge that we already have through behavioral psychology.
And Dr. Westermann, can you expand, given your research in the Nazi East, certain, let's say, precedents used whenever, if one of these perpetrators would have been prosecuted? I think I recall that you cited an event where a Lithuanian policeman had enacted a series of killings or executions, and that he just claimed that the Germans had given the men so much schnapps to drink that he didn't know what he was doing. Is there a precedence involved here? Is there a history? Have these perpetrators been prosecuted in any way?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because in Germany, under German law, there is such a thing as diminished capacity. And that is in place before the Nazis come to power. And actually, it remains in place. So, for example, in SS and police courts, if individuals could prove what in the German term is Volltrunkenheit, like they were completely debilitated by having drunk, right? They had drunk so much that they were no longer essentially in control of their reasoning abilities. That was seen as mitigating for crimes committed, right? And so under German law, there was a diminished capacity alcohol defense. And where that also becomes very interesting is that's in place after the war. So in some cases, what you have is, as these German SS and policemen are being investigated after the war about activities that they were involved in, many of them would say, hey, I wasn't there that day, I was on leave, or I didn't participate, I was in the kind of, if you will, the picket area around the killing site, I didn't participate. But if they were placed at the site and they were placed at participating by other witnesses, in some cases, many of them would use the alcohol defense, right? They would bring up, well, I had been drinking. That's the only way I could participate. I was forced to drink. And this is actually something for many of your, who are going to be watching this, the idea that we know in Chris Browning's book, Ordinary Men, that alcohol is used as a coping mechanism. And as you noticed, when I talked about the various uses of alcohol, that's one of the things that I didn't talk about. And this is, I think, is really an important point, because if you look in historiography dealing with the Holocaust, if alcohol is mentioned by historians, normally it's mentioned, if at all, very briefly, and it's mentioned with the idea of, yeah, it was for coping for the perpetrators, right? And I think that this is something that was brought up earlier, that it's very difficult, I think, for sometimes for us as historians or social scientists to think about, there are people who are enjoying being involved in this, and that it makes it easier if coping is the answer, that the only way they could do it is if they drank, because that's the way we think, because we can't imagine ourselves in that kind of, if you will, genocidal, homicidal kind of mindset that these men get in. And so it's become kind of the shorthand. And if we look at the physiology of alcohol use, I'll give you another example since Sabah brought this up, I think, which is another point that relates to this. We have guys like Carl Jaeger, who is the head of Einsatzkommando 3, that goes through Lithuania and murders over 100,000 people in the first several months of the invasion of the Soviet Union after June 1942. And we have Friedrich Jekyll, who's one of the SS and police leaders, who's involved. And these guys are really profligate drinkers. But in some of their writing, they talk about, hey, I have stomach problems and I have trouble sleeping. And many historians have looked at those types of testimony and said, "Oh, of course, I know what that is. It's a psychosomatic reaction to the fact that they're involved in killing." So they're having bad dreams and they're having stomach issues because their body's literally rebelling at the type of killing they're involved in. But then if you look at the medical literature on heavy alcohol use, for example, right? Well, two of the main symptoms of heavy alcohol use, bad sleep and intestinal ulcers or stomach ulcers that are they're involved in this as well. And so what I'm not saying is that that has to be the answer. But what I do say is that we want it to be the other answer often, because that allows us to understand them, right? That, oh yeah, they couldn't have enjoyed it. They couldn't have celebrated it. They couldn't have been involved in this way. And then when I talk about a guy like Carl Jaeger, who a year after the invasion of the Soviet Union, right? This guy who is having these problems sleeping or with his stomach, he's arranging a special reunion with his major lieutenants in December of 1942 for them to travel from Berlin to come and join him in the East to have a reunion celebration, a 1-year reunion celebration. And when you start again adding that up, that's a much different kind of the idea of the mentality of the individual now as well. Wow, that doesn't sound like he's having that really a lot of troubles with what he was involved in. In fact, they're going to have a drinking reunion because that's what they're going to do. They're going to get together and they're going to celebrate that. And so when we start looking at those kinds of behaviors and looking at some of the physiological effects, I think is important because as Sabat talked about, it is corroborative. I think in many cases for behavioral. And what we know from the social sciences is that alcohol and aggressive behavior are there's a clear correlation in bars, for example, masculinity that you asked about earlier, Luis, this idea of hypermasculinity or even machismo, right, in alcohol. Homicide and alcohol use is not a cultural context that's only Nazi Germany. We can look at colonial Mexico, and there have been studies of that. We can look at the Soviet republics and the Soviet Union, and we see this correlation between alcohol and homicide, for example, and acts of homicide, or acts of homicide that involve against women that also involve sexual violence. So those correlations are definitely there. And how alcohol works on the brain chemistry to kind of facilitate that, I think, is another area that would help us to kind of understand, or at least get to maybe some of the disinhibition, but also to some of the facilitation of these acts that I've talked about earlier as well.
I just have again a comment. I rather than a question, but I'm thinking about how we speak about the ordinary perpetrator. So, we have moved from thinking about, the perpetrator as an extraordinary perpetrator who commits an extraordinary evil. And we've associated the image of, the devil and of Satan with this perpetrator. And of course, well, thankfully, we're a little bit more disillusioned. We're a bit more clear about that. And today, as genocide scholars, we recognize the fact that you do not have to be extraordinary to commit to perpetrate evil. And so there has been for a while now this focus on this idea of terribly and terrifyingly normal, as Alex Mullers talks about, and we obviously have other scholars who, even Hannah Arendt, who speaks about the banality of evil, and starts to, and of course, although we dismissed her thesis about Eichmann specifically, we still think that her thesis is still valid and can apply to other types of perpetrators. So my question here, as a scholar in the field, is to just wonder, when you are speaking about the use of alcohol by these perpetrators, and what Christopher Browning, also brought up in terms of emphasizing the ordinariness of these perpetrators. My question is, and I continue to question the truism, are these perpetrators really ordinary?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've known Chris for a long time, and we've kind of had that discussion as well. And I think it all comes back to how we define ordinary. And so this is where I think social psychology does help us. So we know, for example, from social psychology, in an average population of 100 individuals, anywhere from 2.5% to 5% are going to be what we would consider to be psychopathic, right? That psychopaths are no larger in the population than 2.5% to 5%, which is really important to think about, because what that then tells us is that anywhere from 97 to 95% of an average population is not. And so that means, just like in the SS, even though it was self-selecting, there were certainly those who were sadists and psychopaths in the SS, but the majority of them were not. And so that idea of normality, in that case, ordinariness, is that it's ordinary to society. And I think that Jean Hetzfeldt's work, Machete Season, right, where he looks at his perpetrator interviews, is really fascinating. In You see how these are really men in general, and some women, but majority men that he talks about, that were just absolutely average, normal villagers, farmers. They were not, they weren't in a special paramilitary. They weren't special police or anything like that, right? And they become involved in this process, right? They engage in this kind of genocidal camaraderie. And there are specific figures that can, individuals, and this is why I do think leadership, organizational culture, and leadership within organizations is, to my mind, extremely important when we think about how organizations can be crafted and how leadership can influence organizational behavior of members. And what that doesn't mean is that in Germany, for example, every policeman thinks the same or goes to the limits of acceptable behavior, which is murder in this case, but that every policeman can choose to go to the limits of that acceptable behavior if they choose. And in fact, they might be rewarded for doing so, right? And so this idea of how organizational culture is another way to think about groups, and how leadership, ideology, belief system, culture can influence the way that they act as a group, where some members may be more inclined to participate than others, or to go to the extreme of the behavior. And one of the things, when I talk about German police exactly with respect to this topic, is I have these series of police reports that are essentially weekly police reports taken from the occupied Eastern territories. And what these police units would be, these would be a police company of some 130 people writing there. Okay, we got to write the weekly report. And part of that weekly report that they had to write was, in this period of this week period or 2-week period, the following number were bezeitigt, killed, put to the side, and then they would list vagrants, Jews, communists, asocials, and they would put the number. And then what they would often do as well is they would put the gender of those killed. And then the next heading that they had in those reports, in the same reporting period, the following were arrested. And they would have then categories as well. And what's very interesting is when you look at a week or biweekly reporting period for these, you find that in some cases, you have people that are killed under one justification, asocial, mentally ill Jews. And then you have in the same reporting period, also those same categories of people that were arrested. And as I was thinking about that, how do we explain that? Well, it could be something that different people went out on patrols during those periods. And so you had perpetrators who are more inclined to kill, and they could because they would use the same the same designation, right? And they could say mentally ill. How did they determine that? Did they have psychological expertise? The individual is deciding that's going to be asocial. What does that mean? The individual is deciding that, and they killed. Or it could be something as mundane as a police patrol that goes out and they're now 15 kilometers or 20 kilometers away from their base, saying, oh, we ran into a group of people. Are we really going to drag these 10 people all the way back for interrogation? It's going to hold us up, right? We're not going to get there till night. So they could choose. Maybe they chose to say, okay, we're going to execute these individuals because it's too much trouble to bring them back and do the interrogation. And I don't know what the specific answers are in those cases, but the fact that the same categories of individuals and groups are mentioned in the killed and in the arrested shows that the individuals had choice. The individual policemen had choice as to what they could do with those specific people. And so this, to me, again, getting back to the idea of what is ordinary, I think it gets back to, I think the way that many of us think about ordinary, including myself when I first heard it, is that, okay, it's just people like me or you. But I think the problem with that ordinary, that kind of definition of ordinary, it lacks all the extrinsic and intrinsic factors that are part of our, quote, ordinary group. The police, this group from a given village in Rwanda that were on a sports club together, and how they then as a group engaged in killing, right? So I think that when we think that term ordinary, somehow we think about it in terms of our own self versus putting it in the context of those other factors that are ordinary for that group, but not necessarily ordinary in a given society at a given time.
And I think what is even, well, ironical here is when we spoke about psychopaths earlier, and we speak about them as a small group. And again, we want to distinguish them from the rest of the group, as you said. And we say, well, they're very few in number and all of that. I was reading James Fallon's book on the psychopath inside. And while studying the brains of psychopaths, by mistake, I think his brain scan got mixed up with the others. And he found out that there were similarities between what they looked like. And so it made him, he embarked on a study then to find out why he had the brain scan of a psychopath. And the deeper he got into the research, his conclusion was that we're all, well, the whole category of even normal, ordinary, functioning individuals could also have the characteristics of the brains of psychopaths. So then again, and it's just that maybe it's at a different degree of how you exhibit the behavior in society. So what I'm saying is that even the category of psychopaths is actually not really distinct from the category of ordinary people. So that's why I think it's very legitimate for us as scholars in the field to question this truism about the ordinariness of perpetrators.
If I could, I think that raises also a really interesting point. So for psychology, we go with the DSM, and the DSM is, the diagnostic manual. And at one time, alcoholism was listed in the DSM, right? And other things have been listed, whether it's homosexuality, right? And what happens over time, though, right? If we look at DSM-5, it's alcohol use disorder. And so the idea is there's no longer a diagnosis of alcoholism. It's alcohol use disorder. And why that's important, because it really gets back to what's ordinary. And my students don't necessarily, and some of the people I talk to, I think they kind of go like, oh yeah, wow, that's kind of an interesting point. Because when I talk about someone, if I were to say to us, okay, well, let's do our interview today, and I'm going to have a couple scotches while we're doing the interview, and then at lunch I'm going to have a couple martinis, and then I'm going to come home and I'm going to drink some more. Immediately, in a modern context, we would think, wow, you've got an alcohol problem. He's probably an alcoholic, right? But if anybody that's watched Mad Men, which is 1950s New York advertising agency, it reflects that idea. Those guys would start a morning meeting, mid-morning meeting. They're drinking highballs or they're drinking alcohol. They go to lunch. They're having martinis. They come back in the afternoon. They have some more drinks at meetings or in the office, and then they go home and they have drinks as well. And by a contemporary standard, we're saying, man, those people really have an alcohol problem. Now it's doing damage, right? We know there's physiological damage with that type of drinking. But that type of drinking in the 1950s, for example, was not seen as being a pathological type of drinking. It was not seen as a negative drinking behavior, right? And so I think that this is also really important to understand. If we were, the three of us were in New York in a working class neighborhood, and it's the 1940s, and we wanted to go into a working class bar, and we did that, what we would find is normally it's a male only space. Women that were allowed in there, they're kind of the back room, and they were a quote of questionable morals, right? So it was a male space. And how did you differentiate yourself in that male space in the 1940s? How you could hold your liquor and how you could use your fists, right? And Pete Hamill, who's a writer, I really love his stuff. He has a book called A Drinking Life, and he's from New York, and he reflects back on his childhood in New York and his subsequent his own subsequent struggles with alcohol until he gives up alcohol. But the point is that, right, in a contemporary context, most of our students, most of the people are not thinking that that was a normalized context at the time. And so this, oftentimes I have people say, oh yeah, you talked about the Nazi alcoholics. That's why they did it, right? And that's why it's really important to stress that alcohol wasn't necessary or sufficient, right? It's something that accompanies this behavior, but that type of drinking is not specific just to the U.S. in the 20th century, right? It crosses over into other cultural contexts.
Dr. Westermann, I'm curious in your discussion about the behavior of these perpetrators, because you mentioned several things in regards to them. I don't know if there's one way of assessing their behavior, whether it be coping, celebratory. It seems that there's several effects going on here. But one thing that comes to mind whenever I read your work is that you discuss the forced use of music in concentration camps as a tool for humiliation, usually accompanied either by drinking alcohol or even by dancing. Can you speak to how did this practice impact either the prisoner's psychological state and sense of identity, or even what it reveals about the Nazis' methods of control and dehumanization?
Yeah, thank you, Luis, for getting back to that's a point actually that when I was doing the book, this was the most surprising thing that I found in my research, was this incorporation of music and song by the perpetrators. And it was not something I had hitherto really thought about as being something that was there. So where we see that, for example, is we see it even before the Nazis take power. We see it in the Nazi paramilitaries, especially the SA. So they have these songs. They have these music ensembles for marching. And in Nazi rituals, so in gathering rituals, we have the same thing, the use of music, the volume of music and how it's used. And when I talk to this about my students, I try to talk about, just think about the best music concert you've ever been to, right? And how when you're in that arena, when you're in that stadium, how that music um, transforms the way that you see yourself. It transforms the way that you think. So you have a psychological reaction to that. Then start to think about, in a place like Nazi Germany, where some of that music is very much, some of the songs are anti-Semitic. They incorporate concepts and ideas of violence against groups, or ideas of racial superiority that are tied to that. And how in the singing of those songs, how that group camaraderie is built. But I also in the book talk about those who are the outsiders, in this case, Jewish men and women or children, who are listening to these groups marching down this music, listening to the words of the songs that are being sung, and how that's a form of, I call it vocal violence, really, that's directed at them. And again, if we look at Rwanda, we have survivors who talk about how the perpetrators, how Hutu perpetrators also use song, both men and women, and how those songs in some cases are about sexual violence or impending sexual violence, right? So how song itself becomes a weapon of humiliation, a weapon of violence against groups, and in the camps, forcing, for example, Jewish musicians to perform, to play songs for the perpetrators. And I talk about in one of the camps how the musicians are thrown scraps of bread, like you would throw to an animal that performs for you, right? That does a trick for you. You would see also where Treblinka has its own song that celebrates Treblinka's role in murder, and the inmates are forced to sing it. So they're forced by the SS to sing songs that are also humiliating and and degrade them, right? So they're forced to become involved in this process of degradation themselves. So the way in which song is incorporated in a number of different ways to include that idea of humiliation of individuals, what songs you're allowed to sing, what songs you're not allowed to sing, and also in the case of the victims, how some of them try to appropriate their own songs, for as a sense of resistance, right? So we have a group at Auschwitz of French communists that are going to be executed, and they go to the gas chamber singing the Marseillaise, right, or singing Communist International, right? So how you have groups, also Jewish groups, that attempt to reclaim some form of identity by singing in that case. So I think that's really that's an important point. And Nancy Love has a book that I was really interested in when I was starting this project, and she was kind enough to share a copy with me. It's called Trendy Fascism, and she looks at what's the white power music scene. And in that scene, the volume of the music, the lyrics of the music, the incorporation of drinking in these group meetings that are part of it, how in fact we see how different types of genre of music. So, for example, there's a small, and I want to emphasize this, a small group of metal, right? That's white power, essentially metal. That's racist metal kind of singing, right? And so we had this. We had the idea of the Resistance music label, which was all about this kind of white supremacist use of song or music. And I think that's important to remember, because music, sometimes and I was one of those who thought of that as kind of a progressive, as a good, as a intrinsic good. And then I saw how it's intrinsically used, or used as an intrinsic kind of bad in this case. And that to me was really an important insight in the way in which, again, camaraderie, which we tend to think of as a good thing, but it has a flip side. Music, which we tend to think of as an intrinsic good, actually also can be used in very nefarious ways as well.
In the example that you gave regarding the Nazi perpetrators' use of, let's say, forced musical performance, how much would you characterize that as an exercise of control versus perhaps them taking part in this very perverse celebratory aspect of this phenomena? Because you've also talked about how they can go ahead and enact acts of terror while inebriated. Is this separate? Is this intertwined to just an exercise of control?
Yeah, I think it gets back to how there's manifold uses of alcohol by perpetrators. I think, and they're not always disentangled. Sometimes they're entangled in different cases, or they cross over at different times. They're used by the perpetrators in different ways. I think that music and the use of that music and the way that you talk about is it also crosses over, right? It crosses, it can be used for manifold reasons. So you do have several survivors who believe that the only reason they survived the camp is because they were singers and because the Germans enjoyed having people perform for them. So their ability to sing at a kind of a professional level, whether it's German songs, Schubert, whatever, we want to talk about operatic songs, whatever, they remember that they would be appreciated. They had to perform. They're performing for the Germans, but it had the benefit of an additional, a couple of pieces of bread or a lighter labor, whatever the case may be. And so I think that the idea of how music is used really is there's several levels to the way that music is used by the Nazis, and it depends on the context and the situation that develops. And there's several different, I think, examples of that throughout the book. So it's really an interesting point. And what some people may not know is that Nazi Germany was described by some as a Singerdiktatur, which is literally a dictatorship of song. And what does that mean? Is that a song was used very purposefully by the Nazi Party as an ideological instrument for indoctrinating children. And song is an ever-present ritual in party functions and party gatherings and youth gatherings. And again, this is something that if you think about Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, I don't remember a lot of singing when I was, a Boy Scout. I mean, maybe if you went on a camping trip, you might, but it wasn't like integral to, we're going to, every meeting, we're going to have songs and we're going to sing, we might do a pledge or something like that, but we weren't doing songs. And so sometimes, again, I think this is where the cultural specificity of some of the things we're talking about is what we have to interrogate. How does a given culture use things like poetry or song or music? And then how is that incorporated amongst perpetrators or amongst groups in the way that they attempt to influence followers? And to me, that's another really interesting and kind of fascinating trajectory to take in looking at this topic.
No, I was just going to say everybody needs entertainment, and it's interesting how art, music, and everything else is used by absolutely everyone, whether it's a perpetrator or a survivor, whether for comfort or whether for encouragement.
If Dr. Westermann, you could expand perhaps on this thought, because I think the fact that the Nazi perpetrators, of course, held this shared culture, of course, in a way with their victims, given that they would have gone ahead and both known the songs of Haydn or, the Lear of Schubert, and they would have seen that as a way to entertain themselves. You can't really have that, I would assume, if the victims of your actions are of a completely different, let's say, language, culture, that you can't relate to. I would like to ask if you go ahead and if you can say that there are any other historical or contemporary contexts where parallels can be drawn, and what unique aspects were present in the Nazi context, whether it be regarding the music, regarding the use of alcohol or narcotics.
Yeah, so anybody who's watched Schindler's List, right? Yeah, you might be familiar. There's the scene of the ghetto clearing, and there's in all the chaos as the ghetto clearing's gone. You see these SS men going up, shooting people, grabbing people out, and then you have one of the SS men who's playing the piano, and another SS man who's involved in going down the hallway and killing people sticks his head in. And I think he says, "Bach." Or a Mozart, right? And so he's asking, which is it, right? And I think what Spielberg was trying to do was especially if we think about this idea of German high culture, the idea that, people think about Beethoven, Bach, they think about Mozart, they think about how music is integral to this idea of high culture and how the part of it, the same thing with Goethe, this land of poets, right, that gets talked about in the German context. How could that culture that valued all these high culture, what we would call high culture types of things, how could they become involved in this kind of genocidal activity? And I think, right, that the point is that those are artifacts of an like you said, of a certain kind of entertainment, of a certain kind of appreciation. But just because you have those artifacts, it doesn't inoculate you against hatred. Or, for example, in the case of Nazis, saying, well, Mendelssohn or others, well, those are no longer that music is, quote, Jewish music. That can't be played. It's taken out of the musical corpus, right? It's eliminated, it's canceled, if you will, in that case. I think that there is really, even though it seems like a paradox, and I talk in the book, there's a Soviet woman, and she remembers she was a school teacher, and she's taken prisoner. She's also part of the resistance against the Nazi occupation in the Soviet Union. And she's taken prisoner and interrogated by this group of Germans. And she remembers not only the beating, but she's collectively sexually assaulted by a group of these men. And she remembers in her memoir, she remembers lying battered and beaten on the floor of that room where she's just been abused. And what does she hear coming from the next door, where these men now are on the other side of the door? She hears the clinking of glasses and one of the men saying, "Now the tiger is tamed," referring to her. And she remembers a Schubert melody playing in the background, right? What seems to be this like completely paradoxical juxtaposition of that. But really, what we have to again understand is the music itself is just a cultural artifact, just like the use of alcohol is a cultural artifact. It's the actions of the perpetrators and the fact that what's jarring to us, again, psychologically, is you mean someone who has an appreciation for classical music can actually then be a perpetrator of that kind of sexual violence? And the answer is, well, yeah. And that's just, I think this is where, this is again, where in our own minds we tend to have these stereotypes built up. And that when we encounter, right, when we encounter this kind of dissonance with that, what it really means is we have to just question why we accepted that stereotype in the first place. Germans appreciate music. I think as a culture, they appreciate singing. And the fact that singing in songs like the Treblinka song that I talked about, that one's composed by an SS man, is very emblematic of German culture of it. But what's in the words? What are the words intended to do? Who's forced to sing it? And now we see how that music is being weaponized by the perpetrators against the victims in this case.
I think of the movie The Silence of the Lambs, and how you have you have Anthony Hopkins, who's depicted as this very sophisticated person who listens to classical music and appreciates art, appreciates good food, of course, and then we see him with all that sophistication sitting there and basically dissecting somebody's body, taking out his brain and cooking it. So I'm just saying, in my mind, I think these references, which we can of course relate to, which do sort of indicate that these characters do exist, these stereotypes do exist. For me, at least drive the point home that it's completely possible to like music and high art and still be, a perpetrator in every sense. That's one comment I think I wanted to make on what you brought up so brilliantly today. And I also, well, now I have a question, and I apologize in advance if ever it was already tackled. But I was thinking along the lines of the hierarchical system that existed among the Nazis. And specifically, we do associate that maybe in a very stereotypical way to German society and Germans in general. Now, what I thought about immediately was how, the ordinary use or the everyday use of alcohol is often put towards equalizing individuals. So, for instance, it is not unknown that in professional circles, employers will take employees out for drinks, as an icebreaker, and to be able to blur the lines that exist among them and to make people feel comfortable. I'm actually wondering how this would have played out in that sort of setting in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because it allows me to get back to a point that I wish I'd spoken about earlier. So Heinrich Himmler, who's the head of the SS and the police, and essentially the so-called architect of genocide, the SS, he's responsible for translating Hitler's vision for a Europe free of Jews into reality. He, in his own mind, uh, wants his men to be quote unquote decent murderers, right? He doesn't want them to become these prolific killers who enjoy the bloodlust, right? And so one of the ways that he says that he wants them to help them maintain their decency is after the killings, he wants them to have what he calls fellowship evenings. And the way he envisions these fellowship evenings is the men would come back from the killing site, and they would have music, reading of poetry, and they might drink one beer, but no more than two beers. And they would definitely not talk about the events that they were involved in that day. That they were not supposed to talk about that. But it was supposed to be almost a way for them to decompress and to share that camaraderie amongst each other, right? And in fact, what happens at these fellowship evenings, they take place throughout the East and they take place in the concentration camps, but they're debauches, essentially. I mean, it's heavy drink. They split up the goods of the plunder that they've taken. They talk about the attributes of the victims. They talk about the attributes of the female victims. For example, if we're thinking Jean Hatzfeldt again, and we're thinking about Rwanda, he talks about how those cabarets at the end of the day are used by the Hutu perpetrators, and they do the same types of behaviors, drinking, talking about the victims, in some cases joking about the victims. And so this kind of theoretical idea that Himmler has for what these spaces should look like in no way reflect the reality of it. And I'm always reminded of there's a Polish teenage waitress, And in her testimony after the war, she remembers how these SS groups would come back several times a week, she says, to their restaurant where she worked. And she talked about how these men would come back to eat, drink, and sing, and they would even play games. And so one of the games that they would play is they'd push each other around in their chairs, like chariot races around the table. And she's talking about this is normal behavior by the killers coming back from these weekly killings. And if you think about it, these are not men coming back and drinking themselves into a stupor with their heads down, right? This camaraderie. The other thing that she remembers, which I think is important, after they've been drinking a while and she's serving them, right, then they start trying to grab her. So she starts having to try to extricate herself from the situation of, sexual violence, sexual assault, right? And so these rhetorical scene, how rhetorically alcohol, music, poetry are supposed to be used by the killers with the reality of what it looks like in those locations is much, much different when we see that. And I think that that's, again, one of the important things when we look at this is how the rhetoric and also how our preconceptions of individuals, how they need to be adjusted with the reality on the ground, and how sometimes cultural contexts and changes require us as historians or social scientists to really be able to understand the context of the time and the group that we're talking about, which can be really, really difficult for students, especially, right? And that's that because otherwise we're looking through a lens of our making, not a lens of their making. And so we have a distorted view of what they're involved in.
Dr. Westermann, thank you so much for your brilliant insight, and thank you so much for your work and research.
Well, thank you, Luis, and thank you, Saba. I appreciate it. It was a delight and clearly awesome questions. So this was a pleasure to be involved in the podcast. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Edward B. Westermann. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.